CG, Bea, and Riv. Are you guys here?
Sorry, yeah, we're here.
All right, cool. I saw that CEO already indicated that they're here. So while I'm doing a judge roll call, I'm not sure what's the status for the live stream. So I think that given teams already know the motion, please indicate whether or not you guys still consent on the chat. I'm going to do the judge roll call while waiting for that. Jayeesh?
Yep, I'm here.
Jonathan?
I'm here.
Wesoamo?
I'm here.
And Youngwoo?
I'm here.
All right. So we have confirmation from CO. CO still consents. What about OG? Do you consent? Okay, OG
I'm
consent.
fine with it.
Cool. In that case, OO also consents. CG also consents. All right, cool. So I think giving it up to the OC to set up the live stream, and then if everything's good, then we can directly begin. All right, while waiting for them to set up, I think that in that case, we can start with introduction from judges and also teams, given it's the open final. So let's hype it up. My name is Omar. I'll be your chair for the round. I go by Dave Am, but please just address the panel as a whole. I will not be able to turn on my camera because it's being live streamed. I haven't showered, so I'm not gonna show the abomination that I am today. Regardless, I'm going to call upon my panel to also introduce himself in the order as they appear on tap, starting with Jayeesh.
Hey everyone, I'm Jayeesh and I'll be your panelist for today. My preferred gender pronouns are he/him, but I would prefer in case you refer to the panel as a whole. All the best to all the teams present.
Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan. I'll be one of the panelists today. My preferred gender pronoun is he, him, and all the best to all teams.
Hi everyone, my name is Wesoamo Zempare. I'll be your panelist for today. Congratulations on making it this far, and let's have a great debate.
Hi, my name is Youngwoo Park. No preferred pronouns and best of luck to all teams.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for that introduction. So Cormac just confirmed that they have returned. So I think before that, we can just go around the room and have teams introduce themselves, starting with OG.
Hi, TJ, speaking first, no preference for pronouns, hoping for good finals.
Speaking second will be Umar, he, him pronouns.
Thank you, OG. Moving on to OO.
Speaking first, Andrews, he, him pronouns.
Hello, everyone. I'm speaking second, Erasmus, he, they pronouns. All the best to everyone.
Thank you. OO, CG.
Hi, it's Riv speaking first, no preferred pronouns.
Hi, my name is Bale, Government Whip.
And lastly, CO.
Hi, Simho speaking member, he, they pronouns, please.
Cormac speaking whip, he, him.
Awesome. So that's everybody. I guess before we begin, you all know what it is. House rules. Number one, time yourself. I'll be putting the timestamps on the chat. Do accept POIs. It's going to be interesting and engaging. Second, indicate your preferred method of accepting POIs. So you're not interrupted in ways you do not want to. Otherwise, the default setting will be through chat. And I think everyone have introduced themselves, but feel free to do so again during your turn to speak. I think in that case, welcome to the open final. With that motion, with that info slide, I call upon Prime Minister to start the debate. Here.
Right, audio check, this good?
All good.
Great. Yep, so once again, no preference for pronouns, POIs in the chat. I'll try to take one from the closing opposition, past 5. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The counterfactual we support in the opening government is not having any colonial determinism in the discourse surrounding the development of Asia. We think what is probably going to look like is that colonialism is still going to have an influence, but there are many other factors that went into it, especially post-independence and what people could have done to change the course of history. It probably looks like a narrative of the collective agency of governments, societies, etc., making the nation across Asia the way that it is today. Note the comparative here, that history will probably be the same, and there's nothing that both sides of the house can do about that. It is just the way we interpret it, which means the factors that we emphasize on the outside of the house to explain and understand history is likely going to be lead to a diversity of academic narratives, but primarily underpinned by the narrative of agency. That is to say, even if it is true that the colonizers had strong influence over the way our society was shaped post or pre-independence, post-independence, what or the power lie within us and our society to change things for the better and to improve the lives of our people today. For instance, instead of the British colonizers coming to set up administrative and judicial branches that lasted till today, causing us to follow it, we interpret it as they set it up, we chose to continue using that system because it was fair. And I will also note that this is empirically true as well, because some nations don't follow the system. Many post-colonial states have abandoned the jury system. Many post-colonial states across Asia have redesigned their parliamentary seats, have passed constitutional amendments and like. We also recognize that although things happen this way, it could have gone another way had certain factors changed. These things are not affected by colonialism. We think this is a likely counterfactual because history is probably most likely to be interpreted by the people most affected about it. These are the people in Asia, in those developing nations, and we want to interpret it as an empowering way. I have just one pretty big argument in this speech, and just how the narrative of colonial determinism in the discourse surrounding Asia is often used as a justification for leaders to hold on to power. I'm going to uniquely tell you how this narrative of learned helplessness prevents people from seeing the possibility of change and how they could have made lives better, especially resolving the divide and conquers and the inequalities surrounding this world. Let's look at examples like Lee Kuan Yew and other authoritarian leaders across Asia and Southeast Asia. In the context of nascent democracies post-independence, these people use anti-colonial rhetoric to hold on to power. They use this as a unifying point by saying that it doesn't matter what race you came from, it doesn't matter how the colonizers treated you, you need to unite and come together in order to push for greater justice. This looks like Tunku Abdul Rahman in Malaysia, like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore and other nations across Asia, similar charismatic leaders that used anti-colonial rhetoric to bridge racial and religious tensions that existed post-independence. Post-decolonization, many states were granted independence, and leaders, however, continue to use this post or anti-colonial rhetoric to hold on to power. Why did they do it? Because in the context of these post-colonial states, you're like forced demographic shifting, you have different racial and religious backgrounds. In Malaysia, for example, you have like Chinese people that were imported, Indian people that were imported to work on the rubber farm, Chinese work in the tin mines, for example. The divide and conquer strategies that these colonizers adopted basically meant that people didn't really integrate with each other because they didn't really interact with each other, but there were also suspicions and internal tensions between the different racial groups all across the world. That is why anti-colonial rhetoric was used to unite people against the common enemy. Why do we think that the narrative of colonial determinism is probably one that is extremely harmful? The first, if you believe that things can never change, then politicians will always use this narrative to galvanize support. Perhaps it is true in our vote, they will still do it at the start of independence, but in the secondary election, third, fourth, and continuing election, this narrative holds less and less power, which means it's easier for you to get reformed. So in the status quo, politicians always use this narrative as a way to galvanize support and political basis. Later, I'll put it in the chat. This diverts attention away from the accountability, especially when when these national leaders seek to abuse their power. Like Tunku Abdul Rahman, for example, essentially jettisoning the negotiations that ended with Singapore leaving the Malaysian Federation, or like the broad swathes of censorship and media control that many of the leaders have to try to justify their position in power. Or the Cambodian president, Hun Sen, being part of the Khmer Rouge, was always able to divert attention away from it by focusing on the anti-colonial rhetoric and the ways in which the past colonizers have hurt them. National leaders in India, like the BJP, like Narendra Modi, weaponizing right-wing populism because he cannot accept that things can change and just saying that the inherent inequalities between the Hindus and Muslims in India were there to stay because things would never ever potentially change. Malaysia, you have corruption everywhere. It's very easy to blame the past oppressors for current problem, to say that racism was the product of colonialism and therefore not support any kind of tax funds to education to equalize access towards wealth and capital and stuff like that. The comparative in our world, if you believe that things can change, you are less likely to buy into this race-based and anti-colonial rhetoric enhancing political change in our side of the house. If you believe that these structures inherently were determined by us, then we have the choice to make it better. We have the choice to focus on reform, making things more equitable, unifying each other, and that's why the political narratives are far more likely to be equitable on our side of the house, at least comparatively across history with galvanized change on our side. Before I talk about learned helplessness, do you have anything from Seal?
The fact that you are irredeemably influenced by structures of colonialism does not mean you cannot make improvements to your country into the future. Why is this rhetoric not symmetric on your side?
It's not that you cannot make improvements in the upside of the house, but you believe that your situations are irrevocably damaged. That is to say, the degree of control you have is far less, which means you are less likely to focus on those things or need to take steps to protect yourself, as opposed to changing those societal structures that you cannot, or that you believe are irrevocably there and that you cannot change. Why do you think learned helplessness is a terrible idea? If we reject colonial determinism, we also oppose learned helplessness because we actually then believe that things can change. So the depth to which this narrative permeates society, if people think that they're condemned to inequality, to poverty, to elitism, etc., and they believe these things are deterministic and cannot possibly change, they're likely to take steps to deal with it to protect themselves, as opposed to trying to change things. What this looks like is probably leaving the nation to find better opportunities elsewhere, which creates a problem of brain drain that is a significant problem across a variety of different countries. But it also looks like refusing to participate in politics because you believe those things will never ever change, and you would rather invest your time, your resources, and your capital in doing other things that directly benefit yourself, as opposed to engaging in political change. Or can just look like doing things like, investing in private enterprise as opposed to social work because you don't think that things in society can change. On the comparative, if you actually believe things can change, you are more likely to want to invest in those things. Rather, we would frame it as movements for fighting for reform exist on both sides of the house, like Bersih in Malaysia or liberal movements that supported Leni Robredo in the Philippines. People are more likely to opt into it in our world when they believe things actually can potentially change for the better. The last thing here is also related to social movement. There are movements actively seeking to reform system, like political dynasties seeking to challenge them, like in Malaysia, where Mahathir successfully won the election, toppling the incumbent government for the first time in 50 years in this nation's history, demonstrate that actual reforms can happen. The fact that people believe things can change in our side of the house is the primary tipping point as to why change is more likely to happen in our world as opposed to the opposition. For all of those reasons, if you believe that you can change things, you are more likely to actually attempt to change things, improve your the life for you, your family, and your future generation. And for those reasons, we're very, very happy to propose.
All right, I thank Prime Minister for that speech. I call upon Leader of Opposition. Here.
All right, just give me a second to wrap up, please. Okay. Great. I'll take POIs via voice because, sorry, just give me a second. Let me start my timer. Because I would be paying attention to my timer, so feel free to ask. But you can also choose not to bother because I'll probably take CG in about 5 minutes into my speech. Great. Awesome. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening Gov talks about 3 things. 1, people escape accountability. 2, authoritarianism. 3, people don't believe that things will change. Let me start from the first one. I think it's untrue that people don't believe that things will change. Why? Because even in the existence of pervasive, colonial determinism narratives, there still exist political parties who are at loggerheads with each other, trying to claim victory, trying to tell the people that they would make things better, trying to tell the people that they are the ones who are going to change the dirty systems, the problematic structures that colonialism created, which means there is still an active discussion about who creates better policies, who is able to ensure that you are able to transition from a poor person to a middle-class individual. And that all boils down to people believing that they can change, and hence they walk out to go and vote. They walk out to go and make political decisions. They involve themselves in political interactions. The mere fact that there exists this kind of colonialist colonial determinism narratives does not mean everybody thinks that the state would never develop and nothing would go on. Like, I think there's a very absurd case to run in the vast majority of instances. Secondly, they say people escape accountability. I think 2 responses to this. 1, I don't think people escape accountability for this reason, specifically for 2 structural reasons. Because opposition politicians are always looking at hunting you. That's why even the most authoritarian states, those leaders are still being ousted. People are gaining momentum through movements, through revolutions to take them out of power, etc. I'm not sure why people just sit and say, because you are peddling this narrative, everything you are doing is justified. Secondly, we think that the idea that they run on is not necessarily that politicians can do nothing about it. Usually is the idea that I am the politician who can do the best things to remedy these situations, which means that they still hold themselves to some extent of accountability standards in a way that makes it better. Thirdly, they talk about authoritarianism. First of all, I am not sure why this is the only narrative by which people can become authoritarian. Secondly, even in the absence of these narratives, terrible economic conditions can still be used, and people painting themselves as messiahs can still be used as a means of authoritarian rule. First, let me talk about something. And I think PM wants to be smart here, because PM says, they support the narrative right after colonization, but they regret it post the secondary and political era. Bullshit, specific for one reason, because the initial happenings that define the political identity of a state is what leaks into the future political identities of a state. Which means if you support it being a core formative ideology within that political structure right from the beginning post-colonial era, it is likely going to be, guys, somebody is unmuted. It is likely going to be the very political narrative that lives on, because most political systems have institutional memory about things that win campaigns. Politicians want to jump on it. They have nostalgia about the messages that won historical political campaigns, etc. Which means they can't eat their cake and have it. If they want to regret it, they have to regret it right post-colonialism, when this narrative started its use. You cannot regret half of it and then say you support half of it. Why then is this very important? Before that, let me talk about how this pervasiveness looks like. It looks like having an institutional memory of this, about your institutions constantly operating on the narrative of being conscious about colonial rule, colonial harms, and being risk averse towards anything that looks like colonialism in the coming future. Social perceptives, right, and perspectives, individual behavior, political narratives, and opposition towards anything of any sort that appears to be even in the slightest form colonialism. This is predominant within the academic sphere, mainstream media, art and movies, social norms like we saw within massive movies, lots of art within Asia dictating when they fought British, when they did this against the British, etc. What this does is to shape individual behavior, shape political ideals and policies in a way that is heavily anti-colonialist, and shape the way and the way they view each other and what commonalities that they share. The right of the top impact that I would give to this is the increasing neocolonialism and the threat of China that wants to recolonize the Asian Pacific. What it means is that most of these countries are set up to never again give a chance to anything that colonizes them, that recreates the very colonial era that they get. That's why most countries are very small. Ordinarily, they should have given in to Chinese pressure, but they are withstanding. Why? Because the people would oppose any politician that is not hard on China and anti-colonialist, because that's the political wiring that has existed within their minds. This creates an institutional anti-colonialist rhetoric, which helps them craft national policies that are resilient towards colonialist rule. And it is very crucial within this movement because the threat of colonialism still exists, with China wanting to recapture the peninsula. And that is crucial because what they try to argue is that the threat of colonialism is on. It still exists within this debate. Before I move on to the other thing about how these states became stable in the first place, let me take CG.
Does this mean we'd also resist interactions with the West? So things like maximizing trade with them, etc.
I think it even enhances it, because now the West is much more conscious of not being predatory towards trade deals and giving you much more aid instead of being predatory and antagonistic, because people and politicians won't go for it because their citizens are wired to always put them out of power when they do anything that appears colonialist. In fact, this improves those relationships in a positive way. I'm not sure why, because that's what we've seen. It exists now. So note this panel. This debate is not about speculating. It's about debating what exists now. What we've seen is the West actually being much more friendly to most Asian countries. So it's not that they are going to be antagonistic and going to take away trade and etc. The second thing I want to talk about is the way states survived in the first place, because states were arbitrarily drawn by colonial rulers, ethnic groups from different places put together when they used to exist in different clans, etc., and fight each other. What this means is that the ability to find a common message that binds all of you right post-colonial era was crucial to sustaining that state and making the formative years of that state very collective and solid. What this did was to build coexistence and unity, collective action and sharing of resources, commonality and hope that we ought to be together to fight a common oppressor and a common enemy, rebuilding the state through community action, etc. The reason why this was crucial is because this was possible is because they saw each other through a common lens, which was being victims of colonialism as opposed to diverse lens of their ethnicity. What this did was to create a solid foundation on which most of these states were able to unite and build themselves right from the ruins of colonization. What this means is that the very survival of the Asian states that we are talking about here was predicated on being able to spread effectively, very massively anti-colonialist rhetoric to sow in people to look towards commonality, which was colonialism, as opposed to differing towards ethnic differences. And that's what created stable states. So even though some of them are fighting now, imagine how the fight would have looked like right from the start. It means that we secured the survival of these states, which is prerequisite to any other benefit within this debate. You need to prove why, without this narrative being pervasive, states would have survived post-colonial era without being ethnocentric and much more selfish. Proud to oppose.
All right, I thank the leader of opposition for that speech. I'd like to remind everybody to be mindful of their time. But regardless, I thank LO for that speech. I call upon DPM here.
All right, am I audible?
Yep.
All right. POIs in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Colonial determinism was the vice that shackled discourse and development. I want to make a few crucial clarifications at the top of the speech. The first is what necessarily is the counterfactual. Because note here that probably blaming colonialism as something that was regrettable probably isn't exclusive to the idea of colonial determinism for the reasons that the opposition argues about why colonialism has had an adverse impact within these areas. The difference here was whether you view the impacts of colonialism as something that was inevitable, where its products were permanent and cannot be changed. Note here that the contention from the opposition was that you want to help the country develop either way. Even in their best case, it was the difference here was the lens through which you tried to help your country develop. 3 things. First, on their side, it erased the pre-colonial culture that existed before the colonizers entered and created their works. So the framework of development that you pursue after the point of kicking the colonizers out forced you to be dependent on the ruins of your former imperialist overlords. It forced you to be dependent on the structure set up by the immediate post-conflict government within these areas, which means that majoritarianism increases on their side. But note that you oftentimes think that, for example, the cost of infusing racial enclaves would be too high, that they should be permanent because these were the things that the British had set up. These are the things that different other imperialist overlords set up within these areas, and it's harder to fight back against them. But secondly, I think it's about how you're able to accept things like aid. Because if you view these people in a light that shows that they're inherently like just really bad and it's just demonizing against them, then you're more likely to reject things like Western aid on their side. Not precisely from the leader of opposition speech. They say you want to be more like wary of the future. So you view all actions by other governments as something that's more like this culture of skepticism. But the problem with this is they don't give you structural reasons why people can have this done in a nuanced way. Because if you want to reject things from other governments and you want to view it in a light where you're very skeptical of them, then it's unclear why you're able to know that China is bad, but you aren't able to know that another country who's willing to give you aid after that is also bad. And that's why the narrative that most people are likely to defer to instead is one of demonizing them in a way that's unnuanced, and the same leaders that control this narrative push people in that direction. But thirdly, if you believe things can't change, then you only do things that benefit yourself in the short term. This is specifically for the political leaders of the time, like leaving the country, or even in the modern ages. Even if you believe you can change, you likely on our side, you'll try to reform systems and participate in politics. And this is led in how in the modern day, there's massive brain drain in Southeast Asian states like Malaysia, because you view that the impacts of colonialism were too large, they cannot be resolved, and this is why people are going to be forever harmed. It's best that we give up and move somewhere else instead, which means the brightest people, the most educated people were not those who are going to remain within these nations, because you view these structures of colonialism as something that cannot be changed and you'll forever be shackled by. But secondly, note the things at the end of the LO speech about shared cultural or economic goals. These are probably symmetric then, but note they don't prove why the only way to access these goals was through a structure of colonialism, right? Because like if you all suffered the same impacts of being like left behind by your former colonialist overlords, then probably the same goals of development still exist. you're still able to align with these goals regardless of whether you have a unifying narrative of colonial determinism. But third, even if you don't believe this, we prove this creates an excessive, unescapable harm, so any alternative is comparatively preferable. So we are claiming that the academic equilibrium will be reached because we can blame other social and institutional factors, we can blame the immediate governments that came after those colonial regimes, rather than solely placing the blame on colonialism. That is a massive form of just dodging accountability. What else does OO say here in response? OO runs on a massive assumption that aligning with China is inherently bad. But like why? Like China has invested lots of things in towards these certain countries. The BRI may have taken some things from people, but I think there's just like a bias within debating that done inherently bad things. I think we're also being able to provide some form of social economic development. But note secondly that the OO is supposed to support status quo because that's the narrative we set in. They don't prove why this narrative has had any successful effect in pushing up nations like China. In fact, I will argue the opposite because China is currently being quite successful right now. And probably even if you take them at their best case, I don't think this is the only narrative that's holding back China. If the hill that the OO wants to die on was that this narrative specifically was able to empower states to reduce their dependency on other large superpowers, then yeah, they're out of the debate. There are three issues I want to talk about in this speech. First, on better social political development. Second, on critique against colonialism. And third, on academia. The first was on social political development. Note our material on why it was used as a justification by leaders to hold onto power received very little response because it was the product of colonial and divide and conquer policies that created these things then. But note it could be a unifying narrative. But the harm was that it was controlled by immediate elites, often majoritarian powers who had the economic and military strength to knock out the colonizers, which is why even if you believe the best case of their side that this was a preferable narrative to alternatives, this narrative in particular that all other narratives aren't guilty of is likely to be shaped by those at the top. Their claim is that, like from the PM, that you aren't able to have these people held accountable because like majoritarian leaders will find other ways to justify themselves, like they're just really strong. But we are from PM argued that not history will drastically change, but at least we remove a tool in the toolbox for them to exert this power. That was good, which is why the odd bench saying everything is symmetric is merely a lazy response and doesn't deal with the nuances of the case here. Note that our side was likely to have the better forms of accountability for these forms of political dynasties because you're able to identify that these are things that they're just like not really saying the truth. They're just saying that these kind of things were the inevitable effects of colonialism. We cannot change them. And that's why these governments are the best ones to govern after the effects of colonialism. The second issue is about critique against colonialism. So I think identifying colonialism was a bad thing while demanding reparations is inexclusive. Like the reasons that they identified for why colonialism is harmful are precisely why you don't abandon efforts for it. Like all of the bloodshed that's been there. So you have like physical monuments left behind by imperialists. So we won't view these people as benevolent. Before that, I'll take CEO. Okay, so I think this also is the stuff about not supporting policies that lead to the upliftment of oppressed communities, like leaving them condemned to poverty forever because they're not supported by these statistics. Sorry, too late. So I think what happens here is that you don't get the policies that lead towards this development, but critique against colonialism, they don't prove why it's going to be a good thing or done in a nuanced way. Because not the biggest things about like demanding reparations from your states are probably not as a result of this policy, but because we recognize the hindrance in development and you still want to demand these things on a more formal level. But the demonization of anti-Western rhetoric becoming your national identity is a harmful thing. Like dynasties, like it wasn't the strength of like Tengku Abdul Rahman and the Malays alone that secured the independence of Malaysia. It was the economic weakness of the British Empire. It was the other nationalist and socialist movements emerging throughout Southeast Asia that contributed to this. I think these are the things that would ignore under their forms of narrative. But secondly, I think people become highly resistant to change. Like more liberal values and the institutionalization of democracy within these areas are rejected by the populace under their side because you view it as something that's a product of neo-colonialism, even if they could be good for these things. Given that we can't say for sure whether they're going to be good or bad, we think the restriction on discourse on their side is going to be something that's harmful, which is why if OO says the West is more wary about trade deals, this is untrue, because if OO is correct and countries are becoming neo-colonialists, they'll probably want to enter in these states. The weighing on this case is simple. We get far more galvanization of action, but note that the enabling of more diverse discourse is the prerequisite to any other impact in the round, because the impacts of odd bench are assuming that people can interpret this narrative in a way that's good. We prove why they'll do it horribly. We prove why history is going to become better. And yeah, we're extremely proud to propose.
All right, I thank DPM for the speech. I call upon DLO to close the front half of the debate. Here.
All right, can everyone see and hear me? So let me put on my lights.
But yes, all good.
All right, cool. I'm setting up my timer, please. All right. POIs within the chat space. If I don't take you by 5, you can, because it's the final, you can just like wave or just say something, and most likely I'll come back to you. Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's helped us get here. All right, so 3, 2, 1. To be very honest, we take this final, and I'm not even going to try to be humble about it. What colonialism does is that it comes in very disguised forms. There's no point at which people say, I'm about to colonize you. It means it comes in very disguised forms, which continually takes away from you without you realizing. At the point at which you think you are done with it and you're about to receive reparations, or you're about to receive a remedy towards it, that remedy in itself hooks you in, and it becomes a vicious cycle which you are unable to escape from. In Asia currently, most of these countries continue to exist in this vicious cycle. The way in which we are constantly aware of it is by perceiving the irredeemability of it, to the point at which you think that you can't be able to recover from it. We do not think it provides the level of defense which people are able to use to antagonize it. And to the point that we all agree that colonialism in itself is a very, very, very bad thing, and something that we should never fall into again, then we do think that it is something that we need to be able to promote. Therefore, the irredeemability is key to this narrative. So, for example, if you go back to Africa, coups are reoccurring. Why? It is because citizens feel like that economic hardship is too much. At least if we have the coup, it can't change things. At least it will be over and we'll get away from it. It happens the same way with all human beings. If you do think that you have the specific ability to recover from it, the level of consciousness that you have to be able to escape from that thing is reduced, and that's why that irredeemability is very crucial to this. Secondly, this is a regret motion, and it's not a prospective one. So most of the things which they say in terms of the perspective of how we deal with these nations, etc., does not count. How then has our interactions been? And I'll be dealing with this under 3 broad topics. First off, let's talk about having the power to change and things like that, and those kind of things. You need to understand that there's a truth narrative to this, and once we have been able to prove that, we win part of the debate in most instances, in the sense that the irredeemability in itself is true, and that's something that opening government does not talk about or contest. In economic terms, in terms of trade, the financial institutions which have been built, which puts Asian countries at the bottom. Why? Because power was taken away from us, and by the time we approach these institutions, we do not have the power to be able to bargain to enter, which we continually live in, and we can never get out of. We can't get out of the Bretton Woods institutions, politics, democracy, interventions. Anytime you decide to take a different narrative, our culture, language, racism, which currently exists, and the division which exists within it. And the reason I'm telling you all of these things is to tackle the false narrative from them that there's some means to change by which you can't change all of these things. You can never change. These guys have us in chains. And therefore you can, it's not an option that is available for all of us. Secondly, the response to countries that try to change or set up differently. Look at what they did to Cuba. Even in Ghana, they overthrew Kwame Nkrumah, post-colonial. Look at Iran and other countries where most of these Western countries invaded anytime they tried to change. Therefore, putting the blame back on them that, you could have done something different is pretty ridiculous. And this goes on even till today. For example, look at the dollar being the reserve currency of the world and how it is crippling other currencies. Go and look at the currency in Ghana today, which is the worst in the world. Currencies within Asia, which is continually suffering. These are not things that leaders can inherently hold themselves to and say that they have the ability to change in most of these circumstances. And that's why I think it's very frivolous that we have the power to change and do some things. This is the truth, and this is the narrative even as it exists. Leaders holding on to power. What is wrong with buying into this rhetoric? Because we told you the specific impacts which we most likely get in terms of the unity which we are able to get, and I'll be analyzing more of it shortly. These guys don't tell us anything about it except to say that the leaders use it to get to power. And so what? Right? Secondly, both narratives could coexist. It means that we regard this as primary narratives, but we also know that there are secondary problems, that even within the problem setup that we are in, there are still people causing those problems, and that we're able to deal with it. And that's how come we have been able to hold our leaders accountable. And that leads me to the third thing, because we have been able to build structures which ensure accountability. We have democracy. We have opposition parties who are engaged in elections, who ensure that most of these things do not happen, that leaders in themselves do not hijack power. But if leaders leaders still continue to hijack power. We think that is going to happen regardless of this narrative. They can use any narrative. They don't need this narrative to exclusively be able to have that power, and they need to exclusively show us how essentially that happens, right? Lastly, how do individuals interact with these narratives? Because recognize that individuals continually face the impacts of this problem every day. How do they cope? The nature of these problems, like the global trade, financial debt traps, racism, ethnic conflicts, like there are lots. We really suffer, right? So having someone to blame is super important, because they do not consistently blame themselves when they try to change, and they cannot. Because I already told you that these are not problems that you just wish away or you just get out of. It also means that they now have the ability to mobilize themselves. They have more empathy for each other, because they recognize that each and every one is struggling, not because of actions of themselves, but actions from the past. And that's what is able to lead to that unity. Because the narrative after colonization was that ethnic groups had played a big role in the colonization by being colluding with most of these Western powers in order to have that specific kind of narrative. And it was important that this narrative did coexist in order to derive that empathy to put those groups together. I'll take a PI from CG.
So I think the main problem with your end is that you're suggesting about integration of a lot of people, minorities, etc. But you're kind of ignoring that there are different ways that the West was able to help individuals. Why do you think that the West being able to help individuals is less important, for example, than other things like their ability to push for colonialism?
No, you can answer that question when you come. Like, why are you asking me? Like, you can answer that question when you come. Change. People have an incentive to change, as no one likes to suffer. Because things like brain drain and all of the other things which they talk are symptoms of poverty, which is going to happen regardless of this narrative. That is to say, even if we do regret this narrative and it did not exist, and all of the problems that exist, you're going to have all of the huge impacts which these guys talk about it. But what does the awareness of it does? Because it prevents recolonization, which Andrews has already given you a context in terms of the impending and how this is cyclical and how this is violent. At least it gives us a self-defense mechanism against the future impacts of it, to ensure that we do not continue to put ourselves deep down. Secondly, we're able to salvage our identity, right? And we think that state survival in itself is very good. That skepticism is very, very good, because the actions of colonialism, I told you, are disguised. But lastly, in terms of foreign policy and interactions with the West, we think that's through which we're able to get reparations. For example, changes in terms of policy, regarding immigration, etc., by which we are able to gain that unique advantage, because we are able to hold them accountable and say, you caused this to us, you are the reason we are in this mess, and therefore we demand these things from you, and we are able to get the level of redress that we get. Look, what colonization did to Africa, Asia is terrible, and we continually live in it, and we can't change it. This is the measure by which we can cope and prevent it from hurting us in the future, and we are proud to win this final.
All right, I thank the DLO for that speech. To open the back half, I call upon MG. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
All right, I'll take my POIs in the chat between the 5th and 6th minute. Probably from opening. Actually, I'll take from closing. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The OG case is twofold. Firstly, politicians will use this narrative to get easy votes and then abuse their power. We tell you, and as kind of pointed out by OO, politicians will use anything to abuse their power and get votes. And therefore, there are politicians that will also preach about the opposite, and they would pander to Western powers, and they can still be corrupt. So this doesn't actually have any value, assured value in the round. Secondly, they tell you about brain drain. You give up hope and you migrate. We tell you that this is probably true, but this is not the most salient point in the round, because most people in developing countries are poor and most cannot immigrate. And so even if they hate and are hopeless, it doesn't really result in that much brain drain. CG will win the debate by explaining how economic development policies have changed as a result of colonial determinism and has stopped Asia from developing. But before I get to the case, resolve two issues. OO says that we need this narrative to unite people because it's the only uniting narrative, the hatred of the West, right? The only thing we need to unite people is to remind them, hey, we are all in abject poverty. We have a lower quality of life than the rest of the world. This sucks. Let's fix it. Everyone likes food. Everyone likes money. But then TLO shafts their first speaker and says that, yeah, if people want to develop, then op will also co-opt this. We tell you that people will try to co-opt this, but they will fail because op results in demonizing the West, right? But then they would try to say this deadlock in characterization, because OG only asserts that determinism results in demonizing the West, but OO says we don't necessarily demonize the West because we can actually have good relationships with the West if we hold them accountable and antagonize them for past sins. This is why this is ludicrous. You don't get fiat to how discourse surrounding colonial determinism looks like. So what is more likely that will result from this? When you tell people that your poverty is because of the West, historically, you will raise generations of people who will obviously hate the West and therefore vote against Western policies. That's why you have less Western embracing. That's why you have certain countries regressing into things like communism, such as Vietnam, and that resulted in bad outcomes, as we'll talk to you about later. But secondly, even if your citizens are okay with embracing the West, Western countries, if you antagonize them, they will hate you, right? They'll probably bomb you. They will go to their alternatives like Japan in Asia, who actually pander and cozy up to them, and they will not give adjustments to you because they don't need to. So definitely, this narrative results in demonization of the West. So why is it bad to demonize the West, right? First level, because there are a lot of benefits to embracing Western markets and it results in present-day development, and it's not even neo-colonialism, it results in globalization. There is no illustration in this debate yet. We will win the debate by doing it. Let's look at actual examples of Asian countries that resisted colonial determinism and buddied up and partnered up with the West. This looks like Japan, when the US basically rewrote their constitution and forcibly opened them up to Western markets and capitalism. They became a bustling economic hub for manufacturing and technology. When Singapore embraced Western capitalism because they don't have national resources, and they offered their land as a strategic trade hub and port to the West to access Southeast Asian markets, they got really rich. We tell you, empirically, these are shining examples of rapid development that the rest of Southeast Asia, including the Philippines, would have looked like if we kept ties strong instead of, demonizing capitalism and cozying up to China and worse actors. Logically, why can following this trend empower other Asian countries? Firstly, because of globalization, right? Japan and Singapore first made a lot of money by pandering to the West, yes, but eventually they received cultural and political power because they gave concessions to the West. They gave concessions to basic things like natural human rights and said that, yes, these existing systems are actually a good thing. And now the West is more willing to give them a platform and things like the United Nations. They're more willing to embrace Japanese culture, for example, as a result of the anime boom nowadays, etc. But secondly, there's no problem with cozying up with the West because it doesn't come at the cost of ties within Asia. OP tries to say that we need Asian unity, but we say this can still happen because these countries, Japan and Singapore, still trade with all of Asia. There's strong trade between Korea and Japan, Japan and Southeast Asia, and even China, because economic interests are largely separate from political and cultural differences. Why? Because out of necessity. The advantage of trade is just so big. Even if these countries don't like each other, they don't like how Western that they are, they still need to get the massive economic benefits that comes with embracing capitalism. It's nothing personal. All of this proves that embracing the West does not worsen strategic ties with Asia, and so resisting the West benefits is counterproductive. But secondly, and this is where we respond to OO and remove CO's chance to win, their case is predicated on, because the West is so oppressive, the narrative in Asian countries is a unified Asia and that this is a good thing. There's a contradiction when they say that, we will somehow resist China, and yet at the same time, we will somehow have unity within Asia. Because when you resist the West, then you have no longer any alternative. And One Asia proponents, countries that say that they're going to increase Asian unity and that they have your traditional desires at once, are usually the most predatory actors. So countries like China, which have preached this narrative, and Asia are a lot worse than the West, even as bad as the West is, right? You have more pernicious means of human rights abuses, worse things like low labor standards, right? Labor regulations or working conditions. And therefore, exporting your labor force there is incredibly harmful. They also do things like debt trapping. They also discriminate against minorities, even Asians like Uyghur Muslims, domestic workers like for the Philippines, right? And Russia, obviously anti-democratic, willing to wage war. They don't really have proper elections, assassinate political rivals. They're so much worse in all of these ways, right? Either that, or instead, Asian countries become very nationalistic. And this is where we actually impact and hijack the case from OG. When we talk about strongman politicians who don't necessarily use anti-colonialism, they just use whatever nationalist rhetorics they can use and become domestic tyrants to ruin these countries. The problem with people in these nations is that they're okay with these strongman leaders because they think that at least they're not a Western power. That's the problem. So they're harder to hold accountable. I'll take the POI from home.
Yeah, given that the West still wanted to deal with Asian countries in terms of trade, in the face of a strong antagonism, they had to be very fair and generous in trade deals in order to get those deals. That's why success you talk about in Japan and Singapore exists. You can't simply fiat in this debate that
No,
colonial
Japan did
determinism
not
didn't
antagonize them.
exist in
Singapore
Japan.
did not antagonize them. That, like, exactly, it's because they embrace these kinds of Western systems, or at least capitalism, which you have not really mechanized how that would have still happened if you didn't embrace the West happen. Sorry, I thought it was 15 seconds. I didn't mean to interrupt. But lastly, if the West is as strong as you say, then resisting them will destroy you. Firstly, because exclusion from Western markets is fatal. Why are Asian markets failing occasionally nowadays? It's not actually because of colonialism directly, right? Look at the 1997 financial crisis when Thailand tried to become independent by the West by depegging their currency from the dollar, and this resulted in a cascading harms. Confidence decreased in Thailand because their fiscal policy was not as stable as the US's. They didn't want to trade with Thailand because they didn't hold dollars, and Western markets basically wouldn't help them because they didn't want to scare the West away, right? Look at the Asia 2008 recession, which was only saved by embracing export-oriented like economies to things like the West, the people who eventually would recover, and therefore we could ride whatever recovery that happens in the West. Lastly, again, I told you, if you demand so much accountability for the West, they're more likely to treat you like the Middle East. They're going to bomb you. They are going to start proxy wars in your area, and they will slap you with economic sanctions even if these worst things don't happen. There are no benefits, right? We don't have much choices as Asia. Unfortunately, we need to embrace the West. We will.
All right, I thank MG for that speech. I call upon MO. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Yep. Alrighty, let's crack on. Where's my paper? All right. Take a bit away from CG. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think the opening half in this debate was generally pretty symmetrical, right? OG claims that like populism is going to co-opt the existence of like anti-colonialism rhetoric. But I'm unsure why this is unique at the point at which like right-wing populism is rampant in France, it's rampant in Poland, it's rampant in like Brazil, it's rampant in America. I'm not sure why anti-colonialism is the only way to achieve right-wing populism in these states. But also I think if they make a good point when they point out that like OO says like the survival of states was necessary to blame colonialism. Like OG also points out that, you know, this isn't completely unique to anti-colonialism, right? We're going to give you an extension about the individuals and their belief in the country and why this is going to make the country significantly better. And we're going to put this on a micro scale, something that OO did, but was doing in like 1 minute in their DLO speech, not just to like turf burn it, right? We're going to give you actual characterization and actual mechanization of how this works. Okay, so let's actually characterize what post-colonial states looks like, because we don't think that this is done very properly within this debate, right? I'm going to give you 3 things. Firstly, these are most likely going to be developing countries, obviously, very obvious, but it's going to have generally a lot of poverty. It's probably going to have higher levels of income inequality. This is probably due to colonialism exploiting the resources and humans of this country as well, right? But secondly, this means that there's probably going to be low confidence in the nation as a whole. There's probably going to be less amounts of nationalism than there is in other like white or colonialist countries. And this is probably going to be due to like the higher amounts of globalization that glorifies the very nations that colonized them in the first place. Places like the USA, places like the UK, places like Germany that glorify their quality of life and the wealth that they unjustly gain due to colonialism and due to the exploitation of these very countries. But also like they firsthand see the low quality of life within their very states, and that probably isn't going to be very good for their confidence in the nation and their the ethnicity within the nation, right? But lastly, they also firsthand see the failures within the state. Things like corruption and right-wing populism that runs rampant within a lot of these states are probably going to be pretty shit for your like confidence within your nation. We think this is probably especially true retroactively when the gap was the largest between white nations and colonist nations and post-colonial nations where they have just been exploited in their past, right? But lastly, note how the most vulnerable people within these areas knows about the failures of their own nation. Why is this the case? Because they experience like white people just shitting on their own nation constantly, like things like poverty tourism, things like getting humanitarian aid from Western nations, which is probably going to be harmful towards the perception of your own ethnicity and probably going to harm your like pride within your own country, right? And lastly, it probably leads to like things like humanitarian aid that doesn't really help within these nations. That probably just probably is done for the sake of making white people feel better about themselves. Okay, what does this mean then? There's probably going to be a significant level of probably going to be a significant lack of confidence within the individuals within their own country and ethnicity within these countries. Why is what changes on the counterfactual within this debate, and why is it so horrible? On the counterfactual in this debate, note how you can no longer blame the existence of colonialism for these issues. That is to say, OG said in their very first minute that you concede that other factors are significantly more important. Colonialism was a factor, but other factors were significantly more important within the development of your own country. This means that you can no longer blame colonialism as the sole reason that these problems exist in your country, and you have to accept them as the failures of your own people, the failures of your own state, even though it was the exploitation of these colonizers in the very first place. What also happens then? You're probably going to also compare yourself to other countries that were able to have better development in these cases. Countries like China, countries like South Korea, countries like Singapore that government wants to keep bringing up, right? This is probably going to be very harmful towards these people at the point at which they believe that other countries were able to use their own people and use their own factors to be able to push themselves up. Why does this not happen specifically in the status quo then? Firstly, we think the use of colonialism as a scapegoat is very effective because each country has different levels or experiences of colonialism. That is to say, your experience of colonialism was probably different from Japan colonizing South Korea, and that probably means that your level of development is going to be different over time. But secondly, they have their own painful memories and histories of colonialism that they can look upon. That is to say, they can go into museums, they can go into their personal, they can probably ask their grandparents because it wasn't that old, right? They can actively look back on and blame because they can physically and mentally look at these things, and it impacts each individual people within these states. But note how not only does this impact every single person in these states in their confidence within their own nation, but it also harms the very individuals that are the most vulnerable people within these states. Why is this the case? Because the people with the lowest quality of life is going to resent their country the most. They have the least to look forward within their lives. They have no unique education. They have no families to look forward to. They're probably going to be fucked over the most by colonization as a whole. Let's take closing government.
So they cry about their past, but what happens then? They hate the West.
Let me
don't
explain that
embrace
now.
them and
Thank
don't
you for
profiteer
asking.
off of them. The West does
impact.
not give them aid or reparations because they're
Okay.
antagonized so much.
Okay, that's just bullshit, right? My whip will deal with that. Like, I don't understand this concept of the West not giving you reparations when the only reason that the West gives you reparations is because they fucking feel bad about you, right? It's not about helping these Asian people that are suffering through poverty. It's to make themselves fucking feel better about themselves. I live in a white country. I know all about making themselves feel better through humanitarian aid, right? Okay, lastly, on why this is going to be significantly better on our side, and these people are going to have actual hope on our side, right? Firstly, note how they believe they were only harmed because of colonialism. This means that they're more willing to support the things that help their own people because they believe that their own people were not the people that failed them in the first place. It is other people that were not within your own countries. Note how this flips things like brain drain, right? Because you're willing to help your own people significantly more when you believe that they weren't directly a reason of your own demise. But secondly, you're very much willing to support your own country and your ethnicity in in being able to do things like getting rid of post-colonial beliefs in your countries, because these things give you active harm within society. At the end of this debate, only on closing opposition are we able to directly analyze the individuals that exist in the states and how they feel harm, how we're actually able to get rid of that pain that exists in post-colonial states. Very proud to oppose.
All right, I thank member of opposition for that speech. I call upon.
It was pretty good. I think it was pretty good, but you still have a lot of work to do.
Unmuted. You're still unmuted. Never mind. All right.
Sorry.
No worries. I call upon government whip. Here.
Hello. Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Hi. Please keep quiet. Sorry, I'm doing a speech in front of my family. I'm quite embarrassed. Okay. POS and chat. I'll try to take preferably from opening opposition. But if not, closing opposition, go ahead and do your thing. Okay. 3, 2, 1, let's go. The structure of my speech is going to be very simple. The first thing I'm going to do is explain why we at CG beat out opening government. And after that, if that's not enough for you, we're going to proceed to ratio both opening opposition and closing opposition. So by extension, we win on engagement in comparison to opening government. First, why we beat opening government. Their broader win condition is that colonial determinism harms Asia, and politicians often weaponize this to galvanize support through populism. We have one broad criticism. We would suggest that if you're going to argue less anti-criminal rhetoric and development, this often does not take into account how structures genuinely compromise people's ability to improve within Asian countries. And the response often was just to push degree of control is less. This is rectified under closing government via RIV's extension, because we suggest that colonial determinism compromises these structures altogether. First, we say that it compromises the topics we choose to front in discourse, how we limit ourselves to fixating on Western influence, how we choose to talk about Western influences, as opposed to fronting our own local and national pushes. Second, it also compromises the solutions we propose. For example, we gravitate towards isolation and protectionism, and towards anti-Western sentiment and rejecting their businesses, rejecting their foreign and direct investment, compromising things like foreign investment and special economic zones. But lastly, RIV gives multiple structural reasons for why protectionism hurts us. For some countries, first of all, a lot of this pervasiveness came after we created bonds with the US already, so which led to the US imposing on us retaliation, bombings, etc., none of which would have happened if you were to open to their offerings to begin with. Second of all, often blaming colonial powers means that national democratic mass organizations like in the Philippines oppose them, or presidents, for example, pandering to the masses by running platforms rejecting the West and saying F them. Third, this is not just structurally, this is also empirically. RIV, when explaining the converse, highlights the countries that were open to operating alongside the West. For example, Japan and the US essentially rewrote their constitution and forcibly opened themselves to Western markets, allowing embracing capitalism, which allowed them to become a large economic hub for manufacturing and technology. We provide the processes, nuance to colonial determinism in Asian development, but also directly clash with opening opposition's pushes on colonialism and suggest that, sorry leftists, but Western imposition is sometimes quite nice. OG is soft because we still kind of remember colonialism. We take the harder stance. Next, why do we beat opening opposition? Push number one is that colonial determinism supports anti-colonialism. First, this perhaps, but to an extreme extent that opposes the West. Second, this is bad because the West brings severe economic and political benefits. RIV says the following things: international regulations, foreign and humanitarian aid, support for post-conflict colonial structures, international economy. Second, these are all crucial to Asia in specific with their history that needed to rebuild democratic structures, create third-party support after conflicts, liberalization, for example, against sexism, racism, homophobia, insofar as a lot of these Asian countries adhere to very traditional forms of religions. But second, what we also do argue to up the ante in versus opening government is to apply the converse and argue what came in rise with Asia. For example, an inclination towards Russia and China and other global superpowers that also adopted or pandered to anti-Western sentiment. We suggested this was bad because not only do they have a lot of perverse incentives, but they cannot be checked and balanced using the international community and other institutions. So things like debt traps and unfavorable deals all became severely possible, and a lot of these Asian countries became vulnerable to those practices. Second of all, they were also severely vulnerable to economic shocks and by drastic policies that were made by these undemocratic states, for example, with China, Evergreen, and the one-child policy. Opening government says we reject as Western aid, and that's bad, without explaining why specifically for Asian countries, we push them further into being massively dependent on Russia and China, and how they lose out on exclusive benefits for having West as an ally. Before I proceed to push number 2 under opening opposition, do you have a POI? Closing opposition. Okay, vibes. Let's talk about the next push under opening opposition. They suggest that the West creates massive problems and we want to hold them accountable. This is broadly untrue because we would suggest it is significantly harder to hold them accountable. When you push them away, you isolate them, and you create an idea wherein they are always the enemy. Because while it is true that you will always label them and the enemy and highlight them for their bad things, it is difficult for you to create a reasonable narrative around what exactly can the West do to be able to be better, what exactly should we do about the West, because you were always seen as a radical opponent towards the West. Second, even if, what is the quality of this accountability? First, it is difficult to engage in discourse across different countries insofar as you are seen as too radical. Second, it is difficult to engage in discourse because politically members of the government and the consul refuse to engage in the West in Caucasus, in the UN in agreements, so negotiations become barely on the table. Third, we constantly make an enemy of the West, and it becomes difficult to work towards the policies that allow us to get the reparations that the opening opposition so wants to staunchly advocate for. Before I proceed, sure, opening opposition.
Yeah, your extension is no trade with the West. But even though majority of countries have huge skepticism against the West due to pervasive colonial determinism, the West have massive positive trade with many of the countries in Asia, like through Pacific trade blocs, which are mainly led by the US, etc. Your analysis is just impractical, and given that this is a regret pushing, you need to prove that this harm is happening.
Okay, so this is not impractical because in Riv's extension, he recognizes that there are some countries in Asia who adopted colonialist determinism. And there are some countries, again, like Japan and Singapore, who did not adopt colonial determinism. And these precisely are the countries that are doing well. Anyway, this is rectified under closing government for 2 reasons. First, we work with them because the framing of our issues do not put blame on the West. Instead, we understand the West's interest to solve hunger, inequality, abject rural poverty, and broader problems that they, as the world's big brothers, want to address, as opposed to saying that, oh, you should solve these things because you did all these wrong things. The next thing is that this is important because opening opposition, like Riv said, cannot fiat that they can say, oh, we'll have connections with the West. Opening opposition promise lofty goals such as reparations, but they do not explain how they can circumvent these obstacles and demand concrete accountability. The last thing I want to push is, why do we beat closing opposition? The broad push on their extension is that white people antagonize Asians so much already, and we no longer blame issues on colonialism, and often we will in the counterfaction, we will compare ourselves to countries that succeed. A huge part of this argument is tautological. They just say that, oh, well, we will also continue to blame the West. Like, obviously, we will not continue to blame the West. But also, precisely, Riv argues that this is bad. They don't really engage much with the structural reasons for why this is bad. But broadly, they say that we will compare ourselves to China. But how? If we're so fixated on creating bodies of research on neocolonialism, writing historical analysis papers and audits on colonial periods, the trend of the academe cannot focus on analyzing success factors of countries that did not adhere to colonial determinism. Conversely, opposition allows ourselves to focus on the success metrics of both adhering to the West and adhering to other colonial powers or other global superpowers. On our end, we benefit from a wider body of knowledge. On our end, we support a wider body of understanding of Asian development. Propose.
All right. We thank the government whip for that speech. To close the entire debate, I call upon opposition whip. You're here.
Just give me a moment, thanks. I just got to organize my paper. Ugh, I apologize for sounding sleepy. It's almost 12:30 a.m. here, so I'm a little tired. I will take a point of information from opening government, just for reasons of diagonal engagement, and POIs in chat, please. Fucking bugs all over my computer. All right. The century of humiliation in China had the potential of tearing the entire nation's fabric apart. People's perception of their own nationhood was at an all-time low. They did not have confidence in their nation. They did not have confidence in their self-perception and their social identity as members of that nation. Since then, acknowledging that colonialism was the cause of the problems, that colonialism has had a lasting impact on Chinese legacy, has meant that the country has unified. The country has been on an increasingly powerful trend. They've been able to collectivize in a way that has not been seen by any other country in the world. And that's, I think, an insight into how the colonial determinism narrative allows people to identify in a way that is positive for the development of their country into the future, allows people to identify in a way that does not make them feel shit about their personalities, about their culture, but actually empowers them, tells them that there is someone responsible for the harms to their society, and that someone was the colonial oppressor. I'm not going to use any fancy words like ratio, vibe check, or delta in this speech. I'm just going to go into the weighing of our case and then responding to the government bench. So, firstly, on the weighing of our case, I would say a lot of the discussion in opening half is about stopping colonialism in the future or stopping nationalism in the future. And I think, as is sort of conceded a little bit by all teams, this is largely symmetric. There are reasons to stop nationalism under the status under both sides of the house. There are reasons to believe that nationalism, or people will still have incentives to do nationalism, similarly with trying to stop predatory behavior into the future. What we say from closing opposition is that the most pervasive effect is on the individual. And that's because we're talking about a discourse narrative. We're talking about a narrative that gets taught from parent to child through, as you're growing up. You get told that the reason why our country has gone to shit is because of this colonial history and how they exported all of our wealth overseas and the lasting impacts of that legacy. You get taught that at school, that that your history is a result of colonial impacts. And that is why that narrative is so pervasive and how it affects individuals. And we told you that the scale of the impact, therefore, is huge because it is affecting everyone in these countries. Oftentimes, billions of people are receiving the impacts of this narrative. They are being told that their country, the problems in their country do have a cause that allows them to feel better about themselves. Closing government's case is about, well, pushing away the West, and I'm going to deal with this individually a little bit later. I think this case is not really grounded in reality, as is pointed out by opening in a point of information that doesn't actually get engaged with by government whip. I think also it's dependent on a huge number of factors. For example, your trade with the West is not just dependent on your view about the West, but it's dependent on what resources you need, what resources you have to sell, like all your diplomatic relations through the United Nations, like who your trading partners are also trading with. There's a huge number of factors beyond like the narrative that exists internally in your country about colonialism, and there's still incentives to do that trade anyway, even if you have that narrative. Let's then rebuild our case. The thing is that government whip essentially strawmans our argument and does not really respond to the real material behind it, which is that the way people's perception is changed is if you have this view that your country essentially the failings of your country are a result of your own agency, that is the thing that is more likely to lead to brain drain. That is the thing that's more likely to lead to people having no sense of unity in their society. Because of the fact that you do not have a unified enemy to push back against, you do not have the source of this problem that you can push back against. It is about that perception and the way that it is taught through society. And I don't think that issue actually gets dealt with by closing government. Let's then deal with closing government's case. But actually, before I do that, I'll take opening government.
Yeah, political accountability is the prerequisite to any economic reform or change, as we prove in OG. Wouldn't the pervasiveness of learned helplessness in your world discourage people from even believing change is possible? And comparatively, by your own analysis, if they believe their leaders failed them,
the problem is you don't actually prove that learned helplessness happens on your side. You assert that this policy means that people will feel learned helplessness, but actually, in reality, if you look at any of these countries, what they do is still try to reform their countries going forward. The fact that your country is impacted in the long run by colonialism and you cannot change that does not mean that you cannot change everything about your country. You will still try to make improvements. And that is actually like the proof is in the pudding with your own examples. You talk about countries like Malaysia reforming their political spaces after their colonial history, or countries like Japan, which means that that they clearly do want to reform those countries. There clearly still is incentive to reform these countries because even though you view colonialism as having a lasting impact, you're still wanting to improve your country into the future. People have positivity bias. They want to make things better. They're not just going to give up. That is not, you'd never prove that. So closing government, their case is well, you don't want to antagonize the West. The first thing to note here is their case doesn't actually prove, it's not actually the case that this happens. If you look at their own examples, these are countries that have traded massively with the West. I think actually they get the causation the wrong way around. The thing is that I don't know why you've turned your camera on, but I'm not taking a POI. I've already taken one from opening. Anyway, so the thing is that they get the causation the wrong way around, because if they look at the fact that the West really wanted to trade with Singapore because they could access a trading hub in Southeast Asia, if you look at the fact that the West was already controlling Japan and had colonized Japan as a result of World War II, that is the reason why these countries open up their trade. It's not because they changed their own narrative and as a result of agency, they decided to open up and therefore make improvements in their country. The West forced them into those decisions because it was in the West's best interest. So their claim that these countries would not have opened up anyway, would not have opened up under our world, does not actually make sense. The thing is that you can acknowledge the history of your colonialism and blame the West for portions of that, but still engage with them in the future for reasons I gave earlier, which is that you have still incentives to engage with the West if it's going to be beneficial for you. And their claim that they won't engage at all doesn't actually make sense. The thing is that if you think that engaging with China is particularly bad, which they just assert, by the way, the countries can make their own choices about these decisions going forward. Countries are able to pick and choose, especially when you're promoting the narrative of looking at the roots of colonialism, the impacts of colonialism in the future. They're much more likely to make rational choices when making those decisions. I've dealt with a fair bit of OG's learned helplessness stuff already and their brain drain. So the last thing I want to say in closing out this speech is we've made an attempt at coming back here, but really I think opening opposition did a stellar job in this debate. They should get the win.
All right. Thank you, Opposition Web, for that speech. So congrats everybody for finishing up the debate. And OC, can we get a breakout room?
Thanks for the round, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thanks for the
Thank you,
debate.
everyone.
Night to
Thanks,
those
everyone.
who've been around. OC, can we get a breakout room? Vibe check with OC.